At the beginning of the story, we will be introduced to a company employee named Joe Doucette. Joe has an ex-wife and a daughter named Mia, who is still 2 years old. It is known that Joe is quite a rascal. He likes to get drunk, even likes to pee carelessly, including other bad things. One time, Joe was asked by his company to persuade a client who would work with their company. But when the client was going to the toilet, Joe instead the client's girlfriend by inviting her to sleep together. It turns out that Joe's actions must be caught by the client, until he got upset and punched Joe in the face. After that, it shows Joe who is drunk on the side of the road until he vomits. Then in the rain, Joe went to a bar owned by his friend named Chucky. However, because the bar was closed and Joe was also in a state of severe intoxication, Chucky finally did not allow Joe to enter. Then Joe left there and accidentally met a woman wearing a yellow umbrella. Here, Joe immediately seduced the woman, but it turned out that the woman was the one who was ordered by his boss to kidnap Joe. In a short time, Joe just woke up after the woman with the yellow umbrella had injected Joe with anesthetic. Joe was seen in a room similar to a hotel room, even though this place was an isolation place. With curiosity, Joe wondered why he was kidnapped and put in that place. Joe was also confused until when he would be in this place. In the following days, Joe was always fed 3 times a day with the same food menu. Until one day, Joe tried to ask the person who delivered the food about why he was kidnapped and isolated. However, the person did not care about Joe's question at all. Then, when Joe was watching TV, he saw a woman who was demonstrating the lower body movement. Joe, who had not masturbated for a long time, so he immediately took the initiative to do it because of the influence of the TV show. After Joe was satisfied, suddenly there was a smoke coming out. It turned out that the smoke would make Joe unconscious. Then immediately, someone went in there to take DNA samples, fingerprints, including Joe's sperm. This person did it on orders from the perpetrator who had kidnapped Joe, so that the perpetrator could slander Joe for the murder and rape of Joe's ex-wife. The next day, Joe saw the news that Joe's ex-wife had died after being raped and left behind her young daughter, Mia. Joe is the one who is considered to have done this, with all the evidence that was fabricated yesterday. Up to this point, we still haven't been told why Joe was harmed to this extent. Years had passed, and he was still kept in that hotel room. In fact, because Joe was so lonely, he made a pillow as his friend. Until one day, Joe found a white mouse that could finally accompany Joe's loneliness. However, Joe was not long made hurt when the white rat gave birth to many children. The hotel even made the mouse be a meal for Joe. Joe, who felt that he was no longer strong, finally decided to commit suicide. However, for some reason, the hotel saved Joe, as if Joe could not die. Years later, Joe saw the news on TV that his daughter Mia was playing a musical instrument. It turned out that Mia had now been adopted by a couple, and they promised to love Mia. Seeing that, Joe instantly became excited again to continue to survive. Even now, Joe will continue to write letters to Mia, so that when Joe gets out, Mia knows that he is not the one who killed her mother. Not only that, Joe will also rebuild his body by exercising. Joe was sure that one day he would be free and could meet Mia again and take revenge on the perpetrator. In the following month, Joe began planning to escape by pulling out the bricks in the bathroom one by one. Until when Joe was really going to run away, he saw news about Mia which said that Mia would give Joe a second chance. Hearing this, of course, Joe was very happy, but also mixed with tears. But not long, suddenly the smoke came out again, which made Joe have to faint, because it turned out that the hotel already knew about his escape plan. Long story short, 20 years later, Joe was finally released, and he woke up in a crate. Joe was seen being given money and an cell phone by the perpetrator who had held Joe. Soon we will be told why Joe was isolated for that long, and who is the culprit behind all this. When Joe was cleaning up the letters he had been writing to Mia, he accidentally saw a woman with a yellow umbrella, just like the woman he met 20 years ago. Immediately, Joe chased the woman. Until when Joe managed to chase her, some young men attacked Joe. Because they thought Joe was doing evil, as a result, Joe was no choice to beat the young men. While the woman with the yellow umbrella immediately left. After taking down the young men, Joe returned to chase the woman with the yellow umbrella. When Joe approached, it turned out that the one carrying the yellow umbrella had now changed to be a man. At that moment, Joe planned to beat up the innocent man, but a woman named Mary immediately stopped Joe. It is known that Mary is a nurse who works at the clinic. That Mary, who saw Joe, was very panicked. She immediately gave her business card to Joe if Joe later needed medical assistance. Then Joe went to his friend Chucky's residence. Here Chucky is so shocked because Joe has disappeared for 20 years without news. Then Joe told all his stories to Chucky. Until shortly thereafter, the iPhone given by the kidnapper, which Joe was now holding, suddenly rang. It turned out that the one who had contacted Joe was a mysterious man, and he claimed that he was the perpetrator who had isolated Joe for 20 years. Then Joe asked Chucky to join him in looking for the real perpetrator through the internet. Here Joe tries to remember who the people are who have been hurt by Joe in the past, starting from his clients, former bosses, and people who have hung out with Joe. For hours, they both continued to search until Chucky was exhausted, and he decided to sleep while Joe would continue his search. The next day, Chucky found Joe unconscious because Joe was probably so exhausted. Immediately, Chucky called the nurse from the business card in Joe's pocket, and it turned out that the nurse was Mary. Here, Mary immediately treated Joe, and she also had time to read a letter written by Joe about him looking for the perpetrator who had kept him captive for 20 years. At the same time, Joe finally realized and immediately cleaned up all his letters before Mary read them all. However, Mary, who had read that Joe was looking for the perpetrator, was willing to help Joe. Then Joe and Mary started looking for the perpetrator who had previously contacted Joe by phone, until Joe has the idea to find a restaurant that supplies food to the hotel where Joe was stamped first. That's because Joe ate the same food for 20 years, so he could remember the taste of the food. Joe went to one restaurant after another, until finally Joe was sure that the food from this restaurant had supplied food to the hotel where Joe was kept. Then Joe followed a suspicious person, because the person looked like a mafia and bought food in large quantities. After being followed, it turned out that it was indeed the person who brought Joe to his place of confinement all this time. Armed with a hammer, Joe desperately went inside, and without hesitation Joe finished off the guards, until finally Joe met the leader of the place of confinement, named Cheney. It is known that Cheney runs an illegal business, where he provides a place of confinement for kidnapped people according to the wishes of his clients. Here Joe tries to force Cheney to tell who Cheney's client is who has told him to keep Joe. Unfortunately, Cheney didn't know about it. Then Cheney told Joe to play a recording sent by the perpetrator. When Joe played the recording, it turned out that the perpetrator only asked Cheney to keep Joe for 20 years, without telling him the reason. After that, Joe tried to get out of the place, because Cheney's men began to arrive. While holding Cheney, Joe told his men not to do anything if they wanted Cheney to stay alive. But on one occasion, Cheney managed to escape, until inevitably, Joe had to fight all of Cheney's men. In this incident, Joe managed to take them down. However, Joe also suffered quite severe injuries. While outside, Joe, who wanted to faint, was suddenly taken by someone to his friend Chucky's house, and the person who brought Joe was the perpetrator who locked Joe up for 20 years. Soon we will be told about who the mysterious figure who has locked Joe up. In short, Joe was treated by Mary and Chucky until Joe recovered. Then when Joe was at Chucky's bar, suddenly the perpetrator contacted Joe, and Joe was shocked because it turned out that the perpetrator was already there. Joe was so angry, he tried to attack the perpetrator, but it was immediately stopped by his men. Then the perpetrator said that he was the one who had kept Joe for 20 years, and he was also the one who had raped Joe's ex-wife to death. As well as slandering Joe, the perpetrator explained that he did all this certainly not without reason, and the perpetrator asked Joe to guess 2 questions from him. First, Joe had to guess who the perpetrator really was, and second, Joe had to guess what was the reason the perpetrator had kept Joe for 20 years. The perpetrator will give Joe 2 days, and if Joe could answer correctly, the perpetrator promised to shoot himself in the head. Not only that, the perpetrator will also give $20 million to Joe in the form of diamonds. But if Joe fails, then the perpetrator will finish Joe, including Joe's daughter named Mia. Long story short, Joe meets Mary, so that Mary can help him find answers to the perpetrator's 2 questions. In the end, Joe and Mary found clues from a piece of music that became the perpetrator's phone ringtone. Every time the perpetrator calls the iPhone phone that Joe is holding, the ringtone will always be the same. Apparently, the music from the ringtone leads to a school called Evergreen Academy, and Joe used to go to school there. Then, they both went to the school to check the school archives. But apparently, the school had long been closed. They were also not allowed to enter by the guard, until they planned to infiltrate the school at night. While waiting for the night, Joe and Mary stayed at a motel not far from the school. It is known that Joe and Mary are now getting closer, and there is a sense of each other. Until when Mary finished bathing, something romantic happened between the two. Apparently, it was monitored by the perpetrator, because all of this was part of the perpetrator's plan. In the evening, Joe and Mary returned to school by sneaking to check the archives stored there. After searching for a long time, Joe finally found the fact that the perpetrator who had kidnapped Joe for 20 years named Andrian Doyle Price. It is known that the Price family is a wealthy family. However, their family was killed and left only Andrian Price. When Joe remembers the past, it turns out that Andrian Price has a younger sister named Amanda Price. And because of Amanda, Joe had to be locked up for 20 years by Andrian. Apparently, Amanda was often bullied by her friends at school, including Joe. Until one day, Joe caught Amanda being forced by her own biological father to have sex. After the incident, Joe even slandered Amanda by spreading the news that Amanda had invited her own biological father to have sex. As a result, all the students who go to school there bully Amanda even more, and consider Amanda a woman who is not a good woman. In the end, Joe now realizes that Andrian, the perpetrator, kidnapped Joe. It was because he wanted revenge for his sister who Joe had slandered. Long story short, Joe will meet Andrian to answer his 2 questions. Here, Mary had intercepted Joe not to go, because Mary was afraid that Joe would be abused by Andrian. But Joe assured Mary that Joe would be fine. He would return home safely. While on the way, Andrian showed a video about the condition of Mia, his daughter who was now being held by Andrian. Joe said that Andrian shouldn't hurt Mia, because Mia had nothing to do with all this. Upon arriving at Andrian's residence, Joe immediately asked where Mia was now. However, Andrian's men immediately attacked Joe, but this time Joe managed to finish off his men. After that, Andrian asked again about the question he had asked before. Joe replied that this perpetrator was named Andrian Price. Meanwhile, the reason Andrian locked Joe up, because Andrian had a grudge against Joe. After Joe spread the disgrace of his sister, Amanda. Then Andrian said that after her disgrace was spread by Joe, Amanda became depressed and always locked herself in the room. Until their father, who also felt ashamed, decided to finish off all his own family, including Amanda. As for Andrian, he was allowed to live by his father, on the condition that Andrian must avenge all this on Joe. Then the father also decided to commit suicide in front of Andrian. After that, Joe is taken to a room, where it turns out that Andrian fabricated the news on TV that Joe watched, while Joe was in isolation about Mia. Apparently, the woman who Joe had thought was Mia was just a person paid by Andrian. Then Andrian showed the real Mia, which turned out to be Mary, the person who had sex with Joe. Andrian has been planning this revenge for decades, including changing Mia's name to Mary when Mia was a child. Knowing this fact, Joe was immediately depressed, bearing a deep sense of shame and guilt. That's because he had sex with his own biological daughter. This is revenge that is so crazy, even more brutal than other revenge movies. After that, Joe begged Andrian not to tell the truth to Mary or Mia, who was his own biological daughter. Then Andrian, who felt his revenge had been avenged, chose to die in his own way, leaving Joe devastated. The next day, Joe came to Cheney while bringing a bag of diamonds that he took from Andrian. It turns out that here Joe asked Cheney to lock Joe back in his isolation room first. Unmitigated, Joe will lock himself up for eternity. Then this old boy movie ended.